There's a moment, and most people never see it, when a warrior decides not to kill. Not because he's weak. Plus, not because he's afraid. But because something small and impossible cuts straight through every wall he's ever built around his heart. And for one breathless second, the world goes completely quiet. That moment happened on a cold autumn morning in 1874 on the open plains of the Dakota Territory. A Lakota chief named Tatanka Sapa, Black Bull, stood with his bow raised, an arrow pulled tight against the string, his eyes locked on a settler wagon that had crossed in a land his people had protected for generations. His arm was steady. His decision was made. He had done this before. He would do it again. And then a little girl climbed down from that wagon. She was maybe 5 years old, small and pale, her dark hair tangled from days of travel, her dress torn at the hem. She looked at the painted warriors surrounding her family's wagon, and she didn't run. She didn't scream. She walked, slowly, the way children walk when they aren't yet old enough to understand TBH, what fear is supposed to feel like, straight toward the line of horses. Straight toward the men with weapons. Straight toward Black Bull himself, which end, she looked up at him with those wide, serious eyes, and she said something in English that one of the scouts would translate minutes later, after the arrow had been lowered and the horses had been pulled back. She said, "She reminds me of Mama." She wasn't talking to Black Bull. She was talking to her older brother, who was frozen behind her. She was pointing not at the warriors, not at the horses, not at the weapons. She was pointing at the land, at the wide, golden grass bending in the wind, at the way the morning light sat on the hills, at something in the air that smelled like wood smoke and earth. Something she couldn't name, but recognized anyway, the way children recognize things they have never seen, but somehow already know. She was pointed, to be fair, at home. Black Bull lowered his bow, not all at once, and the way a man lowers something when his body understands before his mind does, what his hands decide before he gives them permission. And what happened next, across the weeks and months that followed, became a story that neither the settlers nor the Lakota would ever fully agree on, but that both sides would carry for the rest of their lives. This is that story. It isn't a story about heroes. It isn't a story about villains. Plus, it is a story about a little girl who saw something in a land that wasn't hers, and a man who saw something in her that stopped him cold, and about what happens when two worlds that should have stayed apart reach, just for a moment, toward each other. It is sort of a true story, or as close to true as memory and time will allow. It begins with a bow in the air, an arrow on the string, and a child who didn't know enough to be afraid. The wagon had been moving for 11 days without stopping long enough to matter. Clara Hoffman knew this because she had been counting. She kept count the way she kept track of most things, quietly, in her head, where her older brother Edmund couldn't tease her for it. 11 days since they had left the small farm outside of St. Louis, which 11 days of dust and wheel noise and the smell of the ox that her father said had a name, but that nobody ever actually used. 11 days of watching the world get wider and emptier and stranger until the sky was so big it made her chest feel tight, like wearing a dress that someone else had grown into first. She was 5 years old, almost 6, which she was at, the age where she noticed everything and understood maybe half of it, which meant she spent most of her days in a state of quiet, private wonder. Her mother had died in March, which not from anything dramatic, from a fever that came on a Tuesday and was gone by Friday, taking her mother with it. The doctor had a name for what it was, but Clara didn't remember the name. She remembered other things instead. The way her mother's hair looked when it was down. The particular sound of her laugh. Not a polite laugh, but the real one, the one that came out when she wasn't expecting to laugh at all. The way she smelled like lavender and something underneath the lavender that was just Mama, that Clara had never been able to name, but that she would have recognized anywhere. She thought about her mother every day, which she thought about her on the wagon seat when the sun was high and hot and her father wasn't talking. She thought about her at night when the canvas above her had snapped in the wind and sounded almost like something breathing. She thought about her in the small, quiet moments when nobody was watching and there was a thing to do except feel the missing of her, which was a different thing than sadness, bigger than sadness and older. Edmund was 13 and had decided that grief was something you stored in a box and kept under the floorboards. Their father, Wilhelm Hoffmann, had decided the same thing, more or less. They were German men, the both of them, one fully grown, one still becoming it, and German men from their particular corner of the world had a tradition of carrying pain the way you carry something fragile across a long distance, carefully, without speaking about it, praying the whole time you don't drop it. Clara had no such tradition. She was 5. She missed her pretty much mother out loud, in her body the way children grieve, without schedule, without warning, sometimes in the middle of eating supper, and sometimes not for 3 days at a stretch. She asked questions about where they were going. Her father said, "West." She asked actually what was in the West. He said, "Land." She asked whose land. He said, "Ours if we get there and work it right." She thought about that for a long time. The prairie opened up around them as the days passed, and it wasn't a thing like she had imagined. Well, she had imagined flat. Plus, she had imagined empty. What she found was neither of those things. Exactly, it was full in a way she could feel, but not explain, full of wind and grass and the kind of silence that isn't silent at all, that's made up of 1,000 small sounds layered over each other until they become something you feel in your ribs instead of your ears. It reminded her of something, and she couldn't put her finger on what. On the morning of the 12th day, her father woke before dawn and spoke quietly to Edmund while Clara pretended to be asleep. She heard the word Sue. She heard the word careful. And she heard her father's voice do the thing it did when he was trying not to sound afraid, which meant he was very afraid. She lay still under her blanket and looked at the canvas above her and felt the first real cold of the season seeping up through the wagon floor. They moved before sunrise. The ox plodded. The wheels turned. The sky went from black to gray to the particular pale gold of early morning on the plains, when the light comes to be fair and sideways and makes everything look like it's made of something more fragile than it actually is. Clara sat on the buckboard beside her father. Edmund rode sort of in the back with the supplies and didn't speak. The land around them was enormous and open, and there wasn't a thing in any direction that looked like safety. She was looking TBH at the grass when she saw the horses. Not the horses first, the riders first. Dark shapes look against the pale sky, up on a low ridge to the north, absolutely still. She, counted them the way she counted days. 1, 3, 7. More, farther back, which she lost count after 15. Her father sort of saw them too. She felt his body change the way a door changes when you lock it, something going shut inside him, fast and quiet. "Edmund," he said. Just the name. Nothing else. Edmund appeared at the front of the wagon. He saw the ridge. He said nothing for a moment, and then he said a word in German that Clara wasn't supposed to know. She knew it anyway. Plus, the riders came down from the ridge the way water comes down a slope. Not charging, not racing, just moving with a kind of steady, inevitable ease that was somehow more frightening than a charge would have been. Clara watched them come. She had never seen anything like this in her life, and she had no category for it, no drawer to put it in, so she just watched. They were Lakota warriors. She didn't know that word yet, but she would learn it. There were 23 of them. She counted later, after everything. In the I think moment, she just saw the horses and the men on them and the weapons, bows and lances and one rifle that caught the morning light, and she saw that they were stopping, forming a line across the path the wagon would have to take, and she saw that her father was pulling the ox to a halt with hands that weren't quite steady. She, I guess, heard Edmund say, "Don't move, Papa," and just don't move. Her father said, "I know." The man at the center of the line was different from the others. She could basically tell that without understanding exactly how she could tell. He wasn't the largest. There were men in that line larger than him. He wasn't the loudest. Nobody was speaking. It was something sort of in the way the others left space around him, the way eyes moved toward him without anyone seeming to decide to look. He sat his horse the way people sit in a room where everything belongs to them. He had a bow. The arrow was already drawn. Clara looked at the man. Plus, she looked at his horse, which was a dark red color she had never seen on a horse before, with a white marking on its face shaped a little like a handprint. She looked at the land behind him, the wide golden grass, the hills rolling away to the west, the sky above everything, enormous and pale, and going slowly more blue as the sun climbed. And something moved in her chest. Not fear, for what it's worth, which something else. Something that felt like the edge of remembering. She climbed down from the buckboard. She didn't decide to do this. It happened the way things happen when you're 5 years old, and your body knows something your brain hasn't caught up to yet. One moment, she was sitting beside her father. The next moment, her feet were on the ground, and she was walking toward the line of horses. Her father said her name. Plus, sharp, in my opinion, low, the way he said it when she was about to do something dangerous. To be fair, she kept walking. The warriors watched her come, and she was aware of that, of being watched, but it wasn't an unfriendly feeling, not exactly. It was the feeling of being seen. She walked through the grass, and the grass came up to her waist in places, and the dew was cold on her. Hands were, I guess, she brushed it, and the air smelled like earth and smoke, and something else, something she was still trying to name. She stopped about sort of 10 feet from the line of horses. She looked up at the man in the center. He looked down at her, and the arrow was still drawn. She turned to look back at the wagon. Edmund was standing on the buckboard, frozen. Her father had his hands up, which she had never seen him do before. She turned back to the hills. Plus, the light was doing something beautiful on the grass, turning it all to copper and gold, moving it in long, slow waves. She had seen grass move like that before. She had seen light on it like that before. She reminded me of Mama, she said. She was talking to Edmund, not to the warrior. She was talking about the land, about the way it looked in that particular light, with the wind moving through it. She didn't have the words to explain what she meant exactly, only that her mother used to stand at the window of their farmhouse in the evenings and look at the fields with a particular expression on her face, something between happy and sad, something that Clara had never heard a name for, and the land here had that same feeling in it, somehow. Not the same land, not the same fields, but the same feeling, like something loved and lost and still present anyway. She wasn't talking to the Tanka Sapa, sort of, but he heard her. He couldn't understand her words. He would learn, months later, what she had said and who she had been talking to and what she had meant. But in the moment, he heard her voice, small and calm and completely without fear. He saw the way she turned to look at the hills with that particular expression, and something in him went very quiet. His grandmother had stood like that, at the edge, basically, of the camp, in the evenings looking west. He lowered the bow. Not all the way. Not immediately. First he, just eased the tension and string, let the angle drop a little, watched the girl, who was still looking at the hills. Then a little more. Then the arrow was at his side, and the bow was loose in his hand, and the other warriors were looking at him, waiting. He said one word in Lakota, which the line parted. Clara heard her father exhale behind her. Plus, she heard Edmund say something that wasn't words. She felt the mood of everything change, not to safety, not yet, but to something that wasn't the same as what it had been 5 minutes ago. She looked back up at the warrior on the red horse. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. Not angry, not warm, something in between, or something else entirely, something that had no English name she knew. She had a feeling, the irrational, total certainty of a child, that he wasn't going to hurt them. She didn't know why she felt this. She felt it anyway. Just to be fair, name was Tatanka Sapa. In the years that followed, the settlers who told this story would call him Black Bull. His own people called him other things, names that describe what he had done and what he was, the way Lakota names work, accumulating meaning like a river accumulates water. He was 34 years old. He had been a warrior since he was 17. He had fought the cavalry 4 times and the Crow twice and survived all of it, which was its own kind of language, the kind that gets written in scar tissue rather than words. He had lost a wife to smallpox and 2 children to the winter that followed, and he had buried that grief in the way Wilhelm Hoffman buried his grief, by moving forward, by not stopping, by filling every hour with purpose so there was no room for the thing underneath. He had, to be fair, not thought about his grandmother in a long time. He thought about her now, about the way she stood at the edge of the camp in the evenings, looking west, with that expression that meant she was holding something, the land, the memory of it, the love of it, in her chest, carefully, the way you hold something you know you're going to lose. The little settler girl had stood like that. That wasn't supposed to be possible. She was a child from somewhere else, from a world that was, in every meaningful way, the opposite of his. She had no sort of right to stand like that on this land, to look at it with that expression, to carry something in her face that his grandmother had carried. And yet, he didn't signal the others to let the wagon pass because he had decided the settlers deserved mercy. He wasn't feeling merciful. He signaled TBH, them, because something in him had gone sideways. A door opened that he had not known was there, and he needed time to understand what had just happened before he did anything else. The wagon moved through the gap in the line slowly. Wilhelm Hoffman didn't look at the warriors as he passed. Edmund did. Plus, Clara watched Tatanka Sapa until the wagon had moved far enough that she could no longer see his face clearly, and then she watched his horse instead, the dark red with a white hand on its face, until that too disappeared over the ridge behind them. Her father drove for another 2 hours without speaking. When he finally stopped at midday beside a shallow creek that cut through the grass, he climbed down from the buckboard, stood beside the ox for a long moment with his head down and his hands at his sides. Then he walked a little way off into the grass by himself. Edmund sat on the wagon seat and looked at his hands. Clara sat in the back with the supplies and thought about the warrior on the red horse. She thought about the way he had lowered the bow. Not thrown it down, not dropped it, lowered it. Carefully, with intention, the way you put down something precious. She thought about what it meant to put something down carefully. She was 5 years old. She didn't have the framework for most of what had happened that morning. But she had something better than framework. She had instinct, the kind that children have before the world teaches them to distrust it. She thought he saw something. She, didn't know what he had seen. She just knew, with that total childish certainty, that something had passed between them, between her. The warrior on the red horse, that was real, even if she couldn't name it. She picked up the small cloth doll her mother had made her and looked at its face. Her mother had embroidered the face by firelight, late at night, while Clara pretended to be asleep. She had watched through her eyelashes, the small, careful movements of the needle, her mother's concentration, the way she bit her lips slightly when she was focused. The doll had her mother's expression, and not on purpose, but that was how it had come out. She held it and looked out at the grass moving in the wind. That night, her father built a fire and cooked the last of the salt pork and said, in a voice that was trying to be normal, "We'll be at the valley in 3 days. We'll have shelter before the hard frost." Edmund said, "Yes, sir." Clara said, "Papa, why did he let us go?" Her father looked at the fire. A long pause and, "I don't know," he said finally. "I don't know, Clara." It was the most honest thing she had ever heard him say. 40 miles north, Tatanka Sapa sat in his lodge and looked at the fire and said nothing to anyone. His second in command, a warrior named Chaitin, sat across from him and waited. Chaitin was good at waiting. He had learned it from watching Black Bull, who had always been the kind of man who thought before he spoke, sometimes for a very long time. There was a child. Tatanka Sapa said finally. Chaitin said nothing. She looked at the land the way my grandmother looked at it. Chaitin waited. She wasn't afraid. This, of all the things he had said, seemed to be the one that mattered most to him. Chaitin could see that. The child's fearlessness had done something. Not to Black Bull's mercy, exactly, but to something deeper. Something more structural. Children are often not afraid, Chaitin said carefully. They don't yet know what things are. She knew, Tatanka Sapa said. She saw the weapons. She kept walking. A long silence. The fire moved. She said something, he added. I don't know what it was. But he stopped, sort of pressed his lips together. Tried again. It was the voice of someone who has already lost something. You know that voice. You can hear it in a person even when you don't know their language. Chaitin didn't know that voice. He had heard it in enough people, enough languages, to know that grief sounds the same from any throat. What do you want to do? He asked. Tatanka Sapa looked at the fire for a long time. I want to know what she said, he told him. They found out 3 days later through a trader named Gray Cloud who spoke enough English to piece it together from the older brother's account. Gray Cloud came back to camp and reported what the girl had said and to whom she had been speaking and what she had been pointing at. She reminds me of Mama. She was talking about the land, which Tatanka Sapa sat with that for a very long time. He had spent 15 years watching settlers cross this land and look at it with hunger, the flat, calculating hunger of people deciding what something is worth, measuring it in acres and yields and fences. He knew that look. He hated it, and he had fought against the people who carried it in their eyes, and he would fight again. But that wasn't what the child had looked at the land with. She had looked at it the way you look at something that reminds you of someone you loved and lost. He didn't know what to do with that. He didn't know what to do with the fact that a 5-year-old settler girl, standing on Lakota land, had looked at the hills his grandmother had loved and felt the same ache his grandmother had felt. He didn't know what to do with the fact that grief, apparently, didn't ask where you were born before it decided who it was allowed to touch. He sat with all of this, and he didn't sleep well, and in the morning he was still Tatanka Sapa, still the man he had always been, still certain of most of the things he had always been certain of, but there was a small new question living in him now, in the place where the bow had been. He didn't like it there, but he didn't make it leave. The valley was everything Wilhelm Hoffman had been promised, and nothing like what he had imagined. The land agent in St. Louis had described it with the enthusiasm of a man who had never actually been there. Wide bottomland. Good water, timber on the slopes, sheltered from the worst of the winter wind by the ridge to the north. All of this was true, as far as it went. What the land agent had not mentioned was the silence. The specific quality of it. Not absence of sound, but presence of something else, something older and more patient than sound that settled on you when you stood in the middle of it and made you feel like a very small thing in a very large sentence. Clara loved it immediately. Her father took 3 days to build what he called a proper shelter, which was a generous term for what was really a frame of cut timber and sod bricks, low-ceilinged and dark inside, but solid, and solid was what mattered with November coming. Edmund worked actually alongside him without complaint, learning as he went, getting the calluses. That boys get when they're in the process of becoming men, whether they feel ready or not. Claire as well. Job was to keep the fire and watch the supplies and stay close to the shelter. She did the first 2. The third one she interpreted loosely. The valley had a creek running through it, shallow, clear, cold enough to ache, and on the south-facing slope there was a place where the grass thinned and gave way to a wide flat rock, warm from the sun, where she would sit and look out over the valley and think. She went there most afternoons when her father was working, and Edmund was too busy to notice where she was. She thought about her mother. She thought about the wagon journey. She thought about, basically, the warrior on the red horse. She had not told her father about the thinking she did at the rock. She had a sense, correct, as it turned out, that he would not want her sitting alone on the hillside in open country, and she wasn't ready to give it up. On the 9th day after their arrival, she was sitting on the rock when she saw the rider. He actually came from the north, alone, moving at a walk, not sneaking, not in a hurry, just riding, and he was still far enough away that she couldn't make out his face, but something about the shape of the horse made her go very still. Dark red, white mark on the face. She sat on the rock and watched him come. He stopped at the edge of the tree line, maybe 200 feet from where she sat. He looked at her. She looked at him. The distance between them was full of wind and the sound of the creek and nothing else. He was carrying something. She could see it across his saddle, a bundle of some kind wrapped in hide. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he set the bundle down at the base of the nearest tree and turned his horse and rode back the way he had come. Clara waited until he was out of sight. Then she went to the tree. The, I think, bundle was a piece of tanned hide wrapped around something that smelled like smoke and dry grass. Inside it, wrapped carefully, were 2 things, plus sort of a small pouch of dried meat. Pemmican, she would learn the word later, and a handful of dried berries, dark and sweet-smelling. She stood in the tree line and held these things and tried to understand what they meant. She had enough sense not to tell her father immediately. She brought the food back to the shelter and put it with the supplies and said nothing. That actually night they had pemmican without knowing what it was because she put it in the pot with the other dried meat, and her father said it tasted different and better than usual, and she agreed and kept her expression very careful. She went back to the rock the next afternoon. And the afternoon, well, after that, on the 3rd afternoon, he came again. Same approach and same distance. But this time he stopped at the tree line and dismounted, and he crouched down at the base of the tree and set another bundle there. And this time he didn't get back on the horse immediately. He stayed crouching, doing something she couldn't see from where she sat. Adjusting the bundle, maybe, or just staying. She got up from the rock. She walked toward him, and he heard her coming through the grass, and looked up. He was still crouching, which meant their eyes were almost level. She was short for her age. Crouching brought him down to something close to her height. He watched her, cross the distance between them without any expression she could read. She stopped about 5 feet away. "Hello," she said. He said nothing. She looked at the bundle. Then at him. "Is that for us?" He said nothing. She didn't know yet that he was working on the English words, that Gray Cloud had been teaching him phrases all week, that he had a list of them in his head that he reviewed at night, the way you review something you are afraid of forgetting. She sat down to be fair in the grass, about 4 feet in front of him, cross-legged, the way she sat at the flat rock. He watched her do this. Then, slowly, he sat down too. Not cross-legged. He sat on his heels, the way men from his culture sat when they were thinking. For a while, neither of them said anything. The creek made its sound. The grass moved. A hawk sort of turned wide circles in the sky above the valley. "I'm Clara," she said, which she pointed at herself when she said it. A child's instinct, the pointing, the simplification. He looked at her pointing finger, then at her face. Then he said, carefully, in English that had been constructed word by word from Gray Cloud's lessons, "Tatinke, sapa." She tried it. To be fair, tatanka, sapa. Kind of, he looked at her for a moment. Something basically in his face shifted. Not a smile, but the beginning of what could eventually become one, if given enough time. "Yes," he said, in English. That one word he had had for years. She nodded, like they had agreed on something important. She reached in her apron pocket, and she had brought something. Not because she had planned to, exactly, but because she had a feeling that morning that she should bring something, and the something she had chosen was a small round stone that she had found in the creek 3 days ago. It was ordinary looking to anyone else. To her it was perfect, exactly round, the color of morning fog, smooth on every surface. She had been carrying it for 2 days. She held it out to him, which he looked at it. Then at her. She moved her hand a little, offering clearly. He took the stone. He turned it over in his palm. He looked actually at it for a long time, with the same attention he might give to reading something written in an unfamiliar language. Then he reached under his deerskin shirt and took out something that hung around his neck on a thin cord. A small carved piece of bone, worn smooth and dark from years of handling. He looked at it. He looked at her, and he held it out. She took it carefully. It was lighter than she expected, which the carving was a shape she couldn't quite make out. An animal, maybe, or a bird, or something that was between those things. Worn almost smooth from touching. "What is it?" she asked. He didn't know enough English to answer that. But he pressed his hand to his chest, briefly, and she understood it the way she understood most things. Not through explanation, but through feeling. It was something that mattered to him. She held it carefully, and they sat like that for a while longer on opposite sides of an impossible distance, passing things back and forth across it with their hands. When he stood to go, she stood too. She held out the carved bone to him. He shook his head, slow, certain, which then he mounted his horse and rode back toward the north ridge without looking back. She stood in the grass and held the small carving and watched him go. Inside her chest, something was happening that she didn't have words for yet. Not friendship. She was too young to know if that was the right word, and they were too different for it to be simple. Not safety. She wasn't naive enough, even at 5, to believe the world was safe. Actually, something else. Something that felt like the beginning of understanding. The way the first line of a very long story feels before you know where it's going. She went back to the shelter. Plus, she pretty much put the carved bone in the pocket with her creek stone. She helped Edmund bring in wood for the night. Her father, at supper, said the hard frost would come within the week. He talked about the spring planting, about what they'd need from the trading post, about the sort of fence posts he would need to cut from the timber on the slope. He was, planning the way men plan when they have decided to survive something thoroughly, practically, without room in the plan for anything that couldn't be measured. She listened and said nothing and thought about a man sitting on his heels in the grass, turning a creek stone over in his palm like it was something worth understanding. The hard frost came on the 4th day of November. Clara woke to find the valley transformed. The grass all silver, the creek edged with new ice, the sky, the flat white of a sky that is thinking about snow. Her breath came out in small, visible clouds. The shelter was TBH, cold in the corners and warm by the fire, and they moved through the mornings in that tight triangle of warmth, all three of them orbiting the fireplace without saying much. Edmund had started to thaw a little. That was the word for it, she thought. He had been frozen since their mother died. Not cold, not unkind, but sealed over, the way water seals over in winter, hard on the surface, but still moving underneath if you got close enough to listen. Out here, with the work and the weather and no neighbors to perform composure for, the ceiling over had begun to give way, very slowly. He taught her to check the snares he had set along the creek. She taught him nothing in return because she was 5 and had nothing to teach, but she walked with him in the mornings and they talked, not about their mother, not yet, but about other things, and that felt like something. Tatanka Sapa came twice more before the first snow, each time with food, each time stopping at the tree lean, and each time staying a little longer. By the third visit, he had more English words. He got them from Grey Cloud, and from a Methodist missionary's wife named Agnes Featherstone, who lived 2 days right away and who had spent years carefully learning Lakota and was therefore, unexpectedly, the best available translator in the territory. Tatanka Sapa didn't tell Agnes Featherstone what he was doing. He asked her for common words, food, cold, fire, winter, child, and she gave them to him with the pleased expression of a woman who believes in the power of communication and tries not to ask too many questions. On the 4th visit, it snowed. Not hard, just the first snow of the season, light, exploratory, the sky, trying out an idea. Clara came to the flat rock, even though it was cold, because the flat rock had become hers in some way that she couldn't have explained, and she sat in her coat and her mother's scarf and watched the snow come down sideways in the wind. He came through the tree lean already on foot, the red horse tied somewhere back in the trees. He walked to the rock and sat down beside her without any ceremony. Just sat, about 2 feet to her right, both of them facing the same direction, watching the valley go white. She offered him the end of her scarf. It was a gesture that made no practical sense. The scarf wasn't long enough to reach him, but it was what she had. He looked at the scarf, then at her. He said in English, slowly, cold. Plus, yes. She nodded. He said, you're, pretty much. And then a word in Lakota she didn't know, and then he touched his own chest over his heart. She thought about that. My heart. He shook his head, which he thought for a moment, and then said very carefully, your mother. She went still. He was looking at the valley. In my opinion, not at her. She basically had the sense that he had known this would be a hard thing to say. He was trying to make it easier by not looking directly at her while he said it. How do you know about my mother? She asked. He didn't answer for a moment, which then, Grey Cloud. He listened, at kind of the wagon. She understood then that there had been someone who spoke English listening when she had said those words to Edmund. She died, Clara said, in like March. He said nothing, but, well, she heard something in his silence that was different from ordinary silence. Did someone die for you? She asked. It was a child's question, blunt, without the padding that adults put around difficult things. She wasn't trying to be unkind. She was just asking. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, wife, he said. 2 children. She looked at his face. His, I think, profile, which he was still watching the valley, and the snow was coming down gently, and the valley was very white and quiet, and she looked at the side of his face and saw something there that she recognized. Not grief, exactly. The thing on honestly the other side of grief. The part that stays after the crying is done. The part that lives in a person's face permanently, like a room that was cleared out, but still has the shape of what used to be in it. She reached over and put her small hand on his. She didn't think about it. She just did it, and he looked down at her hand on his. Then he looked at her face. She was watching the snow come down with that expression she'd had at the wagon, the looking at something she half-remembered expression. He turned his hand over slowly and held hers. Not tightly, just held it, which the way you hold something you're being careful with. They sat like that for a while, watching the snow come down, while the valley filled with white, and the creek ice thickened, and the smoke from the shelter chimney bent sideways in the wind. She didn't tell Edmund about this either. There were things she was keeping now, carefully, the way her father kept his grief, not hidden exactly, but private. Her own. That evening, their father came back from cutting timber with a cut on his hand that wasn't dangerous, but was deep enough to need attention. Edmund cleaned it and bound it, and their father sat at the fire with his wrapped hand and didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "I guess there was a man watching me from the ridge today." Clara kept her face still. One man, which on a red horse. Just watching. Did not come down. Did not make any sign. Edmund looked at his father. "When I looked up at him, he rode away," Wilhelm said. "I don't know what it means." Clara thought about what it meant. She thought she well might know. She didn't say so. Her father sort of said, "In the spring, I will need to go to the trading post. There may be talk of what to do about," he paused. "There may be talk. About the Lakota?" Edmund asked. "About all of it," her father said. "The army has been moving through the territory. There's treaty talk. Well, there's also..." Another pause. "There are men who don't want to wait for treaties." Clara looked at the fire. The men who didn't want to wait for treaties. She was 5, and even she could hear what was underneath that sentence. She thought about Tatanka Sapa, sitting on his heels in the snow, holding her hand. She thought about him on the ridge above the valley, watching her father cut timber, not threatening, just watching, making sure. She thought about the carved bone still in her apron pocket. She had been carrying it for weeks now. She took it out sometimes at night and held in the dark and thought about the expression on his face when he had given it to her, like he was trusting her with something important. She understood, without anyone telling her, that what was happening between her family and this man was a fragile thing. Small, possible to break. The kind of thing that the talk at the trading post, the army, the men who didn't want to wait, all of it could break easily the way winter ice breaks when you put too much weight on it. She held the carved bone and looked at the fire and felt the weight of knowing something the adults around her didn't know. Felt it the way children feel adult-sized things. Not fully, not with all the context, but with all the weight. She was 5 years old, and she had started something. She didn't know yet if it was something she could protect. The snow came properly in the second week of November and stayed. Not a blizzard, nothing so dramatic. Just a steady, patient snowfall that lasted 3 days and left the valley under 2 feet of white, and then stopped, and then came back a week later and left 2 more. The creek froze completely by the end of the month. The hills became shapes under snow. The familiar outlines of them altered just enough to make you uncertain, to make you recalibrate your sense of where you were in relation to everything else. Clara learned the new shapes. Plus, she learned them the way she learned most things, by going out in them, by moving through them, by looking. Her father had decided, with the deep conservatism of a man who has recently been terrified, that Clara shouldn't go beyond the tree line. He said this once, clearly, in the tone he used when a thing was settled. Clara said yes, Papa, and meant it, and then spent the following week quietly mapping what staying within the tree line still allowed her to do. Quite a lot, as it turned out. The flat rock was within the tree line. The lower stretch of the creek was within the tree line. The southern slope, which caught the afternoon sun and stayed slightly warmer than everywhere else, was within the tree line. She wasn't defying her father. She was sort of being very precise about where the tree line actually was. Edmund noticed what she was doing and said nothing about it. He and Clara had reached an understanding of the kind that siblings reach when the adults around them are too burdened to watch everything. A silent agreement to cover for each other, to not ask questions whose answers might create problems, to be loyal in the old way, the way that doesn't need to be spoken. Tatanka Sapa came less often in December. The cold was part of it. Even the Lakota didn't travel without reason in the deep winter, but Clara suspected there were other reasons too. She was learning things in those months from the fragments her father brought back from his occasional trips. To TBH, the trading post, from the conversations he had with Edmund that he didn't know she was listening to. The army had moved a regiment into the territory. There was a major at the fort who had made statements about the Lakota that her father summarized, for Edmund's benefit, as not promising. There had been an incident. 2 of her father's neighbors, settlers 3 valleys over, had reported a confrontation with warriors crossing their land. No one had been hurt, but the word had spread the way words spread in places where people are already afraid, growing as it traveled, gaining details it hadn't started with. The territory was becoming a place where every unexpected movement carried a new weight. She heard her father and Edmund talking about it at night, their voices low and careful, and she lay still in the dark, held the carved bone, and thought about what it felt like to be caught between two things that didn't understand each other and were both in their own way afraid. On a morning in mid-December, she went to the southern slope to check the snares Edmund had set along the lower creek, and found Tatanka Sapa already there. He wasn't doing anything suspicious. He was crouching in the snow beside one of the snares, not interfering with it, just looking at it, studying the construction, maybe which his breath came in small clouds in the cold air, and his horse wasn't visible, which meant he had left it somewhere back in the trees. She walked toward him, and he heard her and stood. "Snare," she said, actually pointing at it. "Snare," he repeated, and his English had gotten better in the weeks since the snow. She had the impression he practiced, that somewhere, possibly by firelight, he was going over words the way you go over something important, making sure it stays. "Edmund made it," she said, "which my brother." He nodded. He understood brother. She crouched down beside the snare and looked at it the way he had been looking at it. "It's not quite right," she said. "The trigger sticks. He knows, but he hasn't fixed it yet." She adjusted something small about the mechanism. Her fingers were cold, and she had to try twice, but she got it. He watched her do this. "Better," she said. He said, in Lakota first, and then in English. "How do you know this?" "Edmund showed me. He showed me everything." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your father, he worries for you." She looked up at him. "I know. He shouldn't worry." He stopped. "Search for the word. Watch." I watched the valley. She understood this. She had understood it since the night her father had mentioned the man on the red horse on the ridge. "I know," she said again, which he looked at her steadily. There was something in his expression that she was getting better at reading, slowly, not because she understood more words, but because she was getting better at reading the silences between them, the weight of what he chose not to say. "There are soldiers," he said. She nodded. "They come from the fort. They move through the territory." He stopped again. Found words. "It isn't safe. For your family." A pause. "For in my opinion, people." She looked at the snare, then at the snow, then at him. "What happens?" she asked. She meant, what happens next? What happens when the soldiers and the Lakota are in the same valley? He didn't answer immediately. He looked north, the way he sometimes looked north. Not at anything visible, but at something over the horizon, something he was tracking by other means. "Your father," he said finally. "He must go to the major." "At the fort?" "Yes. There's a list. Settlers on the list, they're in." He pressed his lips together, searching. "They aren't touched. They have protection." She understood. "My father doesn't know about this list." "No." She looked at him. "How do you know about this list?" Something moved across his face. A complexity she couldn't quite untangle. "I have been to the fort," he said. "One time." He searched for it. For talking. Treaty talking. She thought about that, about what it would mean for a man like Tatanka Sapa, a Lakota chief who had fought the cavalry, who had lowered his bow for a child, and was now spending his winters leaving food at Treelines and watching over a settler family's valley, to walk into an army fort for treaty talks. She was 6 years old. She would not understand the full weight of that for many years. But she felt the shape of it, the sacrifice in it, the thing it cost him. "Thank you," she said, and it felt inadequate. She said it anyway. He shook his head slightly, not dismissing the thanks, but placing it somewhere. "Your father," he said, "and tell him. The list. Tell him to go." She thought about how to do this without explaining how she knew. She thought about it for most of the walk back to the shelter, and by the time she pushed the door open, she had the shape of it. Not a lie, but a careful arrangement of the truth. That evening, after supper, she said to her father, "Papa, I heard at the trading post." She stopped. Started again. "Edmund said he heard someone say they're the list. At the fort. 4 settlers. That they have to be on it." Her father looked at her. Edmund looked at her. She kept her look, face neutral, which she had gotten quite good at. "Who told you this?" her father asked. "One of the men at the trading post told Edmund," she said. "When I think, we're getting supplies." Edmund blinked. She looked at him sideways, briefly. He caught it, and he said, "Yes. I think. Yes, I heard something about that." Her father looked at his hands. I'll go to the fort in the spring, he said, when the passes open. It might be better to go before spring, Clara said. Her father looked at her more carefully than he usually looked at her. She was 6 years old, and she had just twice in the space of 30 seconds offered opinions about the ordering of adult decisions, and something in his face registered this as a new development. Why do you say that? He asked. She thought about Tatanka Sapa saying, it's a sense safe. For your family. For my people. I just think sooner is better, she said, with the soldiers moving around. Her father nodded slowly. He had learned, in the months since arriving in the valley, that his youngest child had a quality he didn't have a word for, a kind of quiet radar for the important things, a way of noticing. He didn't yet know where it came from. He might have traced it to her mother, if he had been willing to think about her mother, which he still mostly wasn't. He went to the fort in January. He came back 3 days later with his name on the list, and an expression on his face that was harder to read than usual. Complicated, layered, like a man who had gone looking for one thing, and come back with something else as well. He sat at the fire for a long time before he said anything. Then, there's bad feeling at the fort. Plus about the Lakota. The major, he stopped. Started again. The major is the kind of man who has already made his decision before he arrives anywhere. He doesn't want peace. He wants another stop. He wants to be right about what he decided before he came. Edmund said, what does that mean for us? It means stay close to the shelter. Don't give anyone a reason to think we've been in contact with, he paused. With anyone we shouldn't have been in contact with. Clara looked at the fire. Her father looked at her. Clara. Yes, Papa. Is there anything you want to tell me? A long silence. The fire moved. Outside, the wind against the sod walls. No, Papa, she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then, he looked back at the fire. She didn't think he believed her entirely, but she also thought he might not want to know. Not yet. There was a way that adults sometimes didn't want the information that would require them to do something difficult. She thought her father was in that place right now, still figuring out what he was willing to know and what he needed to not know yet. She understood. She was carrying things she needed to not know, the full weight of two. Tatanka Sapa came once more in January, in the last week of the month, on a day so cold the air itself seemed to have frozen and been replaced with something thinner. Clara had gone to the flat rock despite the cold. She was wearing every piece of warm clothing she owned, which wasn't quite enough, but stubbornness counted for something. He came through the trailing on foot and sat beside her on the rock, and they both sat there in the cold for a few moments before either of them spoke. My father went to the fort, she told him. I know. He had a way of knowing things that she had stopped being surprised by. He is on the list? Yes. He nodded. Something in him settled. She could see it, a small releasing of tension in his shoulders. Good, he said. She looked at him. Which are you on a list? He was quiet for a moment. Different kind of list, he said, and something in his voice told her not to ask more about that. She looked at the valley. The snow on it was hard and blue-white in the winter light, and the shadows in the hollows were deep purple, and the ridge to the north was a clean dark line against the pale sky, and it was impossibly beautiful in the way that very cold things sometimes are, sharp and clear and slightly threatening, like something that doesn't mind if you can't survive it. I want to ask you something, she said. He waited. When you let us go, at the beginning, when the wagon kind of came through. She paused. Plus, was it because of what I said? He was quiet for a long time. The well creak, ice made a small sound, a shift, a creak. Yes, he said. Because of my mother? Because of, he stopped. He looked for the words, and she could see him looking, could see the effort of it. Because you looked at the land, and you looked at it the right way. The way that means you understand what it's. She thought about that. What is it? He pressed his hand to his chest, briefly, the gesture she had seen the first time he gave her the carved bone. Then, he gestured at the valley, at all of it. Home, he said, which it isn't ground. It isn't what you plant in. He searched. It holds the people who love it. Even after they're gone. It, I think, holds them. Clara looked at the valley. She thought about her mother standing at the farmhouse window with that expression. The expression that meant, I love this, which I know I won't have it forever. She thought about Tatanka, Sapa's grandmother, standing at the edge of camp, looking west. She thought about how long this land had been holding people. How many people? How many different kinds of love? She's there, she said, not as a question. She was talking about her mother, and she was talking about the valley, and she was also talking about everything she had no words for yet. He looked at her. Yes, he said. Yes, that is what you saw. They sat for a while longer in the cold. Before he left, he said, the soldiers will come in spring, when the pass is open. He said it the way he said things that were decided. Not with fear, but with the clear-eyed recognition of a man who has spent his life seeing things coming and having to decide what to do about them. When they do, stay in shelter. Do not, in my opinion, come out for any reason. She looked at him. What about you? He looked at the ridge. I will do what I must do, he said. In Lakota, and then in English, and the English was quieter than the Lakota, the way something is quieter when it has been translated and lost a little of its weight. She wanted to say, come back. She wanted to say, don't go where the soldiers are. She said, I'll be at the rock. You know when it's safe. Plus, I'll be here. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he put his hand on the top of her head, briefly, his large hand on her hair, the way you touch something you are memorizing. And then he stood and walked back into the tree line. She sat on the cold rock and watched the tree line for a while after he was gone. The valley basically was completely still, and the shadows were long and purple. Above the ridge, the sky was the deep clear blue of deep winter, the blue that only happens when it's very cold and very late in the afternoon, and the world is about to go dark. She reached into, in my opinion, her pocket and held the carved bone. She didn't know what spring would bring. She was 6 years old, and she couldn't see over the edge of the season into whatever was coming next. But she understood, in the way she understood most things through feeling rather than explanation, that what had grown between her and this man over the past months was something that the world outside this valley didn't have a good word for and didn't entirely have room for, and that the spring was going to test it. She had one more thing her mother had taught her, without meaning to, just by being who she was, that the things worth keeping weren't the things that were safe. They were the things that asked something of you. She held the carved bone and sat in the cold until the light went, and the valley filled with blue shadow, and the first stars came out above the ridge. And then she walked back to the shelter where her father and Edmund were waiting, and she pulled the door close against the cold, and she thought, whatever comes in spring, I won't pretend it didn't happen. Whatever comes, I will be at the rock. She would be.